Hello, everyone. I'll be chairing this session. My name is Femi Amao, and I'm from the law school here at Sussex. Today, we have the privilege of having Dr. Emily Lydgate as our presenter today. And the discussant for today is Dr. Stephanie Switzer from the University of Strathclyde. Dr. Emily Lydgate is a specialist in international trade law, and she is a fellow of the UK Trade Policy Observatory. She has published extensively in this area and in the area of international trade law, generally, especially focusing on particular implications for protection of the natural environment. You can read more on her profile in the agenda for this conference. And Dr. Stephanie Switzer is also a senior lecturer, but at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. She is a founding member and co-director of Strathclyde Center for Environmental Law and Governance. She has published widely in the areas of international trade law, international environmental law, and global health law. And again, you can see more on her profile in the agenda for the conference. Can I now invite Dr. Lydgate to make her presentation? Over to you, Dr.
Thanks, Femi. I hope you can hear me and see me. I'm going to share my screen now. The starting point for this talk on dynamic benchmarking foundation for a new generation of trade, environment, and climate agreements, which by the way is completely different from the last presentation, is this enduring fascination that I have with how the EU is handling environment and climate in the UK negotiations. And I find it fascinating because it's groundbreaking, but it's also sort of wildly experimental. And in some sense, a departure from the arguably more plodding moves on trade and environment that the EU is making it in other areas. And I think you could see the EU's approach to UK negotiations in two really distinct ways. So one of them is as an artifact of these really specific and unique circumstances that define, the UK and EU relationship, a sort of bespoke model that could and should never be repeated. And then the other way is providing a template, or at least some interesting ideas for the EU and maybe even other countries to have more meaningful environment and climate cooperation. And for those of us who are sort of working in this area, I think a question that we get asked a lot is, well, what are the really cutting edge techniques or strategies in FTAs for environment cooperation, and particularly climate cooperation? And the answer is that there's certainly room for innovation. So I think the EU's approach actually provides an answer to the question that many academics, NGOs, governments, et cetera, are asking, which is, how can FTAs help support environmental cooperation in an era of net zero targets? So in some sense, this is a sort of legal salvage project. I don't want this, this approach to sort of slip through the waves into oblivion, which, knock on wood, it could be going in that direction. But I also think there's some really serious problems with it. So, and questions that it raises. So today what I'm going to do is first the setup, I'll walk you through some of the existing EU approaches to trade and environment, and then this proposed approach for the EU, for the UK, which I'm calling dynamic benchmarking. And then I'm going to talk about, sort of propose some tweaks to the approach that I think make it more promising as a basis for trade and environment, and particularly trade and climate cooperation, and then do some sort of blue skies thinking about how this might apply in the UK and beyond. But before doing that, I thought it might be just useful to pose this question of, or ask this question of why environmental and climate cooperation is seen as important or relevant to a trade agreement whose basic function is more or less to move goods and services across borders, because it may not seem obvious to everyone. And one thing that always strikes me is that there's really two very different sets of concerns at the core of the EU's approach to this issue. So on the one hand, there's this competitive dimension, which is sort of, we don't want other countries pumping out pollution, CO2 emissions. Their companies don't have to pay. Ours have to comply with all these strict environmental requirements. So that's one set of concerns, which is often described as leveling the playing field, particularly when aimed at the UK. And then there's this kind of more cooperative dimension, which is, goes beyond that in the sense that it embraces environmental protection as a standalone goal. There's a sort of development dimension to this as well, in terms of trying to support countries to have environmental due process. And so these are pretty different sets of motives, and I think sometimes they're in tension with each other. And this is a theme that runs throughout this. And I think the deeper question is about really what are free trade agreements for? Which is a very, of course, hot topic at the moment. So just an overview of existing EU approaches to environmental cooperation and harmonization. So this is my homage to the European Commission and Michel Barnier in their STEPS slide, which some of you may remember they used to present the UK with its options for trade and FTA with the UK. So and the basic logic of this slide is the same as that one, which is, the more market access a country gets to the EU, the more the EU wants to have some control over its broader regulatory environment. So here's where we are now, obviously, at least for a little while longer. And the question is, where will it end up, and what will that look like, assuming there is a deal? So I'm going to start by looking at the sort of arm's length model, the standard FTA model that the EU has been using since around 2009. And I'll run through this fairly quickly, but I think it's important for context. So we have this kind of, you might describe as a best endeavors clause, that parties will have high levels of environmental protection, sometimes described as a non-regression requirement. And then we have a non-derogation and non-regression requirement, which basically means that parties are going to, they agree they're going to enforce their own environmental legislation. So this is sort of the core enforceable provision of a trade and environmental chapter. And then we have sort of process-based commitments to public participation, transparency, access to justice, things like that. And then we have cooperation on MEAs that are of interest to both parties. And MEAs, by the way, stands for multilateral environmental agreements. And then creating some bodies that essentially meet together to try to implement this. So I don't think this correlates exactly in terms of a hierarchy, but these chapters encompass these sort of competitive concerns about trying to prevent competitive deregulation, but also cooperative aims. I'm going to throw a little FTA language at you to improve your Tuesday afternoon. So this is from EU Korea, and this is an example of a non-derogation clause. A party shall not weaken or reduce the environmental labor protection afforded in its laws to encourage trade or investment by waiving or otherwise derogating from, etc., its laws, regulations, or standards in a manner affecting trade or investment between the parties. So there's this, there's a link between the weakening and the benefit to trade or investment. And then an example of a broader best endeavors clause, CETA. From CETA, parties shall seek to ensure their laws and policies provide for and encourage high levels of environmental protection and shall strive, etc. So these are more aspirational, you might say, difficult to pin down. So this kind of approach of the EU has been pretty widely panned across civil society, MEPs, academics, for being just not really that effective. So reasons for this, I just picked out a few. One is that you have this requirement to prove that your environmental deregulation was in order to benefit trade and investment. That's a difficult link, and that really narrows the scope of this. Enforcement is in the EU is not being backed by trade sanctions and not really used. I think there are 0 examples of countries using this parallel dispute settlement for environmental disputes in the EU. And there's, we have this new net zero target, which isn't very well reflected. But, there's another model that the EU uses. Oh, sorry, I forgot to say, I had a little bit more on this. So there's quite a lot of interest right now in changing this. So we have, these drivers of the net zero target and pressure from various sources. But none of what the EU has proposed seems to be exactly sort of revolutionary. So Commission has come up with some proposals, but concluded, well, we don't really actually think that sanctions is useful in this area. And the draft Green Deal pledges to make the Paris Agreement an essential element, which means that we can suspend the FTA for non-compliance, but they're saying, well, we're not going to do that in existing FTA negotiations. So here's another model that the EU uses, which is arguably much more effective, but which essentially requires countries to operate within the EU's regulatory space. And I think this very much sort of follows the logic of market integration. So if we take the example of the Ukraine Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement, well, if Ukraine gets to export manufactured products to the EU without further checks, well, then the EU in turn wants to be able to govern, whether and how it does things like environmental impact assessment or limits emissions and maintains air quality, things that seem outside the bounds of just goods and services moving across borders. And that's what these agreements do, is they align, they require countries to align gradually with an array of EU environmental legislation. And then we have the internal, because of course the EU itself is a trade bloc, and I won't go into this except to say it's even more integrated and there's even more oversight from EU bodies. So this brings us to this exciting topic of dynamic benchmarking, which is my name for the EU's proposal to the UK. So if we revisit my step slide and recall that the Commission used this to basically say there's absolutely no wiggle room for the UK. It has to choose an off-the-shelf model, and here are the options. So, but actually, what the EU is proposing for the UK is totally unique and doesn't fit into any of these. So there's a kind of irony in that. So here's where the UK is now. And what the EU has proposed seems to have elements of the standard model and the association agreement model, but some very unique features as well. So how does it work? Well, first of all, it says the parties have to maintain common levels of protection. So unlike the standard model, where the obligation is that you have to uphold your own domestic environmental laws, whatever they may be, here we have common level of protection. But it doesn't list any specific EU legislation. It's just a thematic list of areas, a very, very wide list of areas. that are covered here, everything from biodiversity to food safety. So there's quite it sort of references the entire EU environmental acquis without filling any of the details. It also includes a sort of, it's been called a ratchet clause. So if both parties raise their levels of protection, that's the new common standard. No link to trade and investment. So it's much broader scope. You don't have to prove that you're lowering your level of protection to benefit trade and investment. And it's tied to sanctions. And we have a sort of parallel approach on climate, which says that parties have to uphold the net zero target, have a system of equivalent private pricing to the EU ETS, and again, non-compliance can result in sanctions. So this is a much stronger approach to climate than the EU has taken in a sort of standard FTA model, and goes much beyond the sort of reforms that I summarized earlier. So in a sense, it's a kind of hybrid, because it's saying we're going to align, but we're going to do it through this really wide non-regression requirement. So it seems to sort of be environmental cooperation with teeth, if such a thing makes sense. But on the flip side, I think it gives rise to a lot of questions. And as drafted, I don't really see how it could be enforced. I think it's not justiciable. So why is that? And here we get to part two. So here are a couple of what I think are possibly even fatal flaws with the approach. And the first one is about common level, defining or understanding what is a common level of protection without having reference to specific legislation. So I think that just the sheer interpretive complexity of this would really have, at the least, a very chilling effect on anyone's desire to enforce it. I mean, I think environmental regulation is a really complex area. So if we took an example of, say, the UK moving from monitoring entire river basins, as is done under the Water Framework Directive, and wanting to do that through the level of individual regions or counties, would that mean lowering a common level of protection? Or, you know, what if the UK decided that we don't want to regulate emissions of particulate matter, and said we're going to do a trading system, permit trading system for some types of pollution? So would that be a lowering of protection? I don't think it's that straightforward. I think these are really challenging issues for for anyone, academics, let alone a trade tribunal, to sort out. And of course, past EU FTAs have really showcased a lack of sort of enforcement eagerness in this area. The other potentially fatal flaw I see with this is that it doesn't seem very clear to me why it covers sort of product standards, particular. So it includes chemicals, it includes SPS, sanitary and phytosanitary standards. That's sort of the food safety area. So what this does is effectively tie the UK to the EU's SPS regulation in terms of a level of protection, but not the specifics of the regulation. So, and I think this is appealing. I can see the appeal of this, including to a lot of constituencies within the UK, but I don't think it makes sense for a couple of reasons. First is that the FTA will also have whole chapters on TBT and SPS, which don't require any harmonization. Neither the EU's or the UK's proposal contain that. So the EU seems to be sort of multilateralizing this commitment on the UK to maintain parity, but not giving it any bilateral market access to reflect that. So I think that's internally inconsistent, doesn't make sense. And also the EU already, more compellingly, EU already requires any product that goes into the EU to comply with its standards in these areas. So there's not really an added value here. So my suggested reform, which is quite a dramatic one, I think, but within the sort of broad spirit of the approach, would be to narrow the scope to targeted commitments that are agreed by both sides, and preferably quantitative ones, because I think those are just a bit easier to monitor and assess. So I put a list there of some areas that might be candidates for this: carbon tax / ETS, and some other areas that the Commission has proposed as being of concern in past treaties and documents. So, but the UK, I think for the UK as well, this kind of calibration of carbon tax in particular would be useful for a major trade partner in terms of its competitive interest in making sure that that EU manufacturers are bearing the same kind of costs as we are with our world-leading net zero target. And then just simply ensuring that it's clear that these are, you know, what we're talking about is things that aren't covered in SPS and TBT and other chapters. We're talking about the environmental, mostly non-product environmental regulation. Okay, so I should probably say, just clarify, because it might be a question on people's minds, that the UK doesn't seem particularly interested in the EU's proposal in this area, nor any of my suggestions about how to change it. And in fact, the UK has the least ambitious approach to climate negotiations, as it has with any trade partner, including the US, which has explicitly said, at least in the current administration, that it won't mention climate change. So it's copy pasted the CETA chapter in its proposed draft for the EU, but eliminated all references to climate change. And apparently there's an energy chapter coming, which will tell us more. So there's not really a lot of interest in an innovative world-leading approach, which strikes me as disappointing, because if you think about it, these are both trade partners that self-identify as environment and climate leaders, and their starting point is exactly the same regulatory framework, more or less. So I think there is a lot of potential here that's essentially being missed. So I'm a bit disappointed about that. But moving beyond the UK, I think it's interesting to consider whether this idea of dynamic benchmarking, targeted dynamic benchmarking, holds any promise for FTAs. And I think that it does. And again, returning to this question of, you know, what are the world-leading approaches to integrating climate change into FTAs? There is, you know, not a huge amount going on that I think is very groundbreaking. So, you know, even the, so this is the question I'm posing: could targeted dynamic benchmarking form part of the trade and environment and climate toolkit in the EU and beyond? So this is the world-leading proposed agreement on climate change, trade, and sustainability, led by New Zealand. And this is quite, I mean, there's a consortium of partners. And this is certainly world-leading. I mean, it has climate change in its title, for one thing. Even that, it doesn't really do much on sort of regulatory cooperation. It's got binding commitments to phase out fossil fuel subsidies, which I think is the most groundbreaking element of it. But it's not comprehensive, I don't think. EU FTAs do bits and pieces. I won't belabor these. But I think for the most part, these are quite general and aspirational rather than really specific and targeted. And then if we look to the broader, the broader sort of international scope of agreements dealing with climate, the Paris Agreement is also, there's also a bit of a hole in terms of international climate cooperation, because what the Paris Agreement does is it requires countries to set plans for reducing their emissions, these nationally determined contributions, but it essentially ducks the question of how to deal with the trade barriers that this might create And it also hasn't been able to come up with a really robust approach to carbon trading globally. Although that could be around the corner, but I doubt it. So that creates this sort of gap, this global gap in climate change cooperation. So how might this work? Well, if you have an FTA negotiation, you could identify with your partner a shared ambition that could be climate change mitigation or net zero targets, negotiate a shared target that might be something like limits on particulate matter industrial emissions, or linking emissions trading schemes, or calibrating carbon tax. And then that would be monitored jointly with the possibility of ratcheting up if both parties agree. So to me, it seems this offers the possibility of moving beyond this kind of cooperative competitive divide by identifying areas of shared interest and monitoring them jointly. I mean, I think, you know, where I am at with this project now is really somewhere in between a kind of policy brief and an academic paper. So hopefully through this session, you can help me think about different aspects of this problem and move it more towards the academic paper side of things. So with that, I will sign off.
Right. Thank you, Emily, for that interesting and stimulating presentation. Now I will invite our discussant, Dr. Switzer, to make our comments. Over to you.
Thank you, Femi. Can everybody hear me? Okay, I'm assuming that's a yes. Just wanted to start by saying thank you so much, Emily, for such a thought-provoking and innovative paper, which I very much enjoyed. I'm going to try and do justice to it in a very specific and limited way. I'm sorry for the international law joke, but I think this paper can't come at a more opportune time. So I think what I want to start by doing is provide a little bit of the context to this from an environmental perspective, which I think often in trade law discourse can get lost, and then move on to talk about a really key point that I fundamentally agree with, that you know, what this comes down to in terms of the UK-EU negotiations is a lack of trust. And I very much agree with your point about we need to build that trust, and I'll go on to talk about mechanisms potentially for consensus building, and then I'll talk about the use of toolkits within trade law and have some comments on that, and then I'll end, if there's time, just with some general comments upon potential learning for the UK in this regard. In terms of the context to this, you know, as Emily said, and I fundamentally agree, you know, there's a real search for more meaningful environmental and climate cooperation within trade agreements. The context of that is, you know, the weekend, the RSPB released a report that found that the UK had failed in 17 of 20 biodiversity targets agreed in 2010. Many environmentalists would actually say that the biodiversity crisis that is building is actually going to eclipse the climate change crisis. There's also a substantial gap within the UK between rhetoric and reality in terms of how we actually get to the ambitious target of net zero. It's fine to set a target, but we also have to have a way to get there. And the UK at the moment is very much lacking that. And I think we see it in COVID, but we also see it in terms of the UK's response to the climate crisis. There's a lack of joined up thinking between government departments in terms of how we achieve our climate change goals. And I think that context is so significant whenever we start to think about the UK's future trade relations, whether with the EU or further afield. And I think another additional context that I think we do have to bear in mind is that there is a crisis of multilateralism, both within the WTO, within the World Health Organization, and this is all relevant in the sense that trade agreements are going to be asked, regional or bilateral trade agreements will be asked to do more, simply because there is a reluctance in certain parties to do things multilaterally, and so trade agreements will be asked to do more. So we do have to think, as Emily said quite rightly, how do we insert more meaningful environmental and climate cooperation into regional trade agreements, because that is in essence quite unfortunately where the future will lie. So linking then to Emily's paper, and I fundamentally agree, and this is a point that Emily's written on, and I love her work so much, is that trust is really what is missing here. I think the events of the past week, I don't want to get on to any debate about the internal market bill, but I think the events of the past week exemplify and are almost a symptom of that lack of trust between the UK and the EU. And, I think Emily is entirely right. I think what the problem is not disagreement in terms of substantives, but disagreement in terms of, just total lack of good faith and trust. I agree with Emily about the potential for targeted dynamic benchmarking in a narrow range of areas. The ETS, linking to the ETS seems, and calibration of the carbon tax seems a sensible way forward, and as a potential way to build that trust. Others have suggested sectoral collaboration, and I was interested that Emily brought in the agreement on climate trade and sustainability, and I think I'm maybe not as pessimistic about that proposed agreement as Emily. I think what I find quite interesting about that is the fact that it's designed, it's obviously not formed yet, but it's intended to be a living agreement which will be updated. So in that sense, it is intended to be dynamic, even though I agree that it doesn't perhaps do much, or it isn't proposed to do much in regulatory terms. I still see much potential in it. Moving on to think then more generally about toolkits, I think as trade lawyers, I think we often think, what's the problem? What's the solution? What if other agreements done? And we look at models, we look at potential frameworks, and I think it's really useful to think, well, what's the best practice in terms of innovative approaches to trade and environment? We saw the use of models, we still see them quite extensively within the Brexit debate, as well as proposals that have been issued. As Emily said, the UK borrowed wholesale, just extracted the bits on climate change from CETA, to somewhat bizarre effect. I think, as Emily has noted in a previous paper, the extensive reference to forestry obviously reflects Canadian goals, maybe not so much the UK. I think more generally, I can see the attraction in toolkits, in models, but I think we also have to be aware of the blind spots that can give us. In the lead up to the Brexit debate, there was a lot of discussion, should we use an EEA model? What about CETA? I think it's important to find best practice, but I think we also need to think, well, what are the other, is that going to blind us to other alternatives? And I think that's why I particularly liked Emily's approach of thinking in a different way. So, building upon what the EU has proposed, but also limiting that approach in a way that's perhaps more realistic, in order to provide sort of more innovative solutions to these issues that we're currently faced with. So I do think toolkits and models are useful, but I don't think they should blind us to the fact that, potentially there are other ways of doing things, and we do need to be creative. My final point is about the fact that we need to be innovative and we need to leave room for innovation. And I think on the UK side, there is much to learn from what the EU is doing. I think its Green Deal is very innovative. Obviously there's consultation in respect of border carbon adjustment. I think the UK can learn a lot in terms of any political fallout or ramifications from that. So I think the UK, regardless of whether or not an agreement is actually formed, I think the UK will still and should still learn a lot in terms of what the UK, or in terms of what the EU is proposing and what it is doing in respect of the ramifications of the proposed Green Deal. So I'm conscious of the time. I will leave it there, but thank you very much, Emily, for such a thought-provoking paper, and you've given me much food for thought in that respect.
Thanks, Stephanie, for that comprehensive comments on the paper presented by Emily. So we're now at the question and answer session, and let me just remind all participants that we will be using the question and answer function at the bottom of the Zoom platform for this purpose. And once we get the questions, I will put it to the speaker and also to the discussant in sets of 3. And we've got 2 questions now, so maybe we'll start with those 2 questions. And this question is from Frank Brower. And the first one says, is the EU conducting a trade sustainability impact assessment of current EU trade negotiations? Do you find EU trade SIA methodology to be weak? And if I may, or do you want to answer that question first before we go to the second one? Emily.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a good question. And actually, I'm not sure of the status of the SIA with the UK. It's a procedural requirement for EU trade agreements, but as far as I know, there's not one happening now. So that's something for me to look into. I mean, I do think that in general, SIA methodology is a bit methodologically heavy on economic analysis and patchy in some of the other areas. On the other hand, they are the only country that's doing them, that kind of integrated assessment, so prominently and regularly. So I think there's definitely promise in that approach, because a big part of knowing the impact of trade on other issues, environmental issues, is actually just trying to find out what's going on with supply chains, and that can, it seems deceptively simple, but actually I think that can be quite complicated, and sometimes there's a vested interest in those supply chains not being that transparent. So I definitely am a believer in the sort of information for transformation school of thought.
Thank you. And we've got a second question from Frank Brower, and it says, will current EU-UK negotiations embed sustainability concerns in the fisheries sector?
So in terms of the chapter, the approach to sustainability in the EU's proposal, it does include protection of the aquatic environment in its broad list of areas in which there should be common standards. But I think that actually showcases how difficult it is to really pin down such a wide and diffuse commitment. I mean, that's just incredibly broad right there. And then there's, of course, separate negotiations on fisheries, which also embed some sustainability concerns. So I think they're reflected in both places to some extent.
Thank you. And then we can move on to the third question, which is from Peter Holmes. And he says, thanks, Emily, for your nice paper. UK government seems inclined to replace ETS by carbon tax. Consultation did not seem to rule out integration with ETS, but how feasible is this in principle and given the state of negotiations?
Thanks, Peter. That's a good question. I mean, the latest I've heard on this is actually that the UK government has a new statement out dating from June, in which they say that, at least this is my understanding of it, they are going to have an ETS, a UK ETS, and they've set a cap for it, which is a bit below the EU's cap, but a bit above our emissions at the moment. So it's not a super ambitious approach. And then there's a carbon price floor of £15. So I think that but there's some conditionality in there about well, if we can link with the ETS, this is subject to revision. But I think this is just yet another one of these alleyways of the Brexit negotiations where the technical complexity is just so overwhelming. I mean, as I'm sure you know, Peter, it took them, was it 7 years to link the EU and Switzerland's ETS scheme. So I think this is definitely going to be yet another potential sort of collateral damage of no deal.
Well, thank you for the answer. I don't know if Stephanie has anything to say in relation to the questions.
No, I can see another question in the webinar chat from the panelists, which actually I'm quite interested in Emily's answer as well. I hope it's okay to ask this. If we negotiated quantitative targets in an FTA, how do we ensure decent measurement, let alone enforcement? Which I had been thinking as well whenever I read your slides. So it would be good to maybe get your opinion on that, if I can abuse my position as discussant.
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. I think that there's a strong possibility that that these would not be measured adequately, that they would fall by the wayside, as so many FTA provisions do. And that's one of the arguments that you have in terms of sort of loading up FTAs with these other issues as they are international law, which is not always the most rigorous way of getting things done. On the other hand, you know, it seems to me that precision is easier to achieve in something like a quantitative target for a carbon tax, which is difficult to fudge, or linking ETS or you know, measuring emissions, though there certainly is room to fudge. So it's not a silver bullet.
Thank you. I think probably, I mean, we've got one last question on the screen. Okay, two questions now. So the first one says, regarding the targeted dynamic benchmarking model, would there be a risk that the need to have a joint agreement on ratcheting up would discourage parties to ratchet up individually? Overlaps with what you said before. Emily, please.
I think that if a country wanted to ratchet up, so let's take the example of carbon tax again, the model would have to be voluntary, so there wouldn't be an implied obligation on the other party to ratchet. It would just be if both sides were moving in that direction, they could adjust the ceiling upwards. And this is to address one of the core critiques that you often hear of non-regression, which is sort of emerging as a principle of international environmental law, that countries shouldn't roll back on environmental commitments. But then that seems to sort of set a ceiling without allowing room for growth or improvement. So that's meant to address that element.
Right. Thank you for your answer. And there's one more question here. I think we've got time for that. And it says, the UK is largely a service-based economy. Why is it so difficult to come to an agreement with the EU as to environmental standards, especially since the EU includes member states that may have more of a comparative advantage in producing / trading environmentally damaging goods? This question is from Ingo.
I think the answer to that is, I think it's a question about the UK government's strategy or priorities. And I think that honestly, I think they're just being a bit pig-headed. I don't have any other explanation for it, because it seems to me, I mean, I am as you heard, I threw many criticisms at the EU's approach, and rather serious ones. I believe I described them as fatal flaws. But to me, it's a very interesting opening salvo, and there's lots that we could do that would be, you know, world leading. So yeah, and benchmarking on carbon tax is a good example of that. So I don't know.
Just to jump in there, I think I would completely agree. It just seems utterly bizarre. And I think it comes back to your point about how in substantive terms, there shouldn't be an issue. But what seems to be occurring is a lack of trust and I think a lack of good faith on the UK side. So I'm in complete agreement with you, Emily. It is very puzzling. It shouldn't be the issue that it is.
Thank you. And one last question just came in. I'm mindful of the time. And the question says, the Commission has pushed back against the use of sanctions in environmental chapters of FTAs, as they claim it will reduce the scope. Emily, it sounds as though this is a sacrifice you are willing to make.
Well, I mean, I think that the question is, this is a little bit of a sort of, well, let me rephrase it into my own question, which is, what kinds of environmental integration can we seek with what partners? Because we already have the EU doing very deep integration on environmental issues in some trade agreements. So the question is, are trade agreements a good place to do environmental integration? Environmental integration, it seems to imply a higher level of enforcement and monitoring. So that's the kind of where the sanctions come in. So I think the thought experiment that I'm doing is, well, could we do that in a more quote unquote standard FTA? And I think the condition for that being, you know, for that being feasible in terms of, and I'm not, I might be missing something in this question, but I think the standard, the question of feasibility stems from identifying genuine shared interests. So you don't have that tension of, well, I'm trying to force this down this person's throat. So I think that has to be an ingredient for any of this cooperation to be realistic.
All right, thank you. There are two questions that came in through the chat that I didn't see before. So I'll quickly put these two questions to you. Maybe I can put the two together to save time. And one is from Alan, and it says, if we negotiate quantitative targets in an FTA, how do we ensure decent measurement, let alone enforcement? And the second question says, Netherlands and France put forward a proposal to enhance TDS chapters and increase monitoring and commitments of more cooperation. What do you think of that? Second, how do you see enforcement evolve?
So I have been looking for the proposal of the Netherlands and France. The last time I looked was about a month ago and I couldn't find it. So if anyone wants to send it to me, I'd be very delighted to read it. But my understanding of it is that they want to link environmental non-compliance with tariffs. I'm not sure exactly how that would function. I think that is, you know, along the lines of what I'm suggesting. In that sense, it seems to strengthen the environmental chapters, which I think I am arguing is a good idea. But again, I think the concern is that this becomes, you know, it becomes something that can only be done on the basis of coercion. And if you look at another country, I mean, because in a sense, coercion, it might not be the right word, but it's a function of market power. So EU is a very valuable prize for exporters, and they might be willing to accept more conditionalities. Whereas for a country like the UK with a smaller market space, or other countries, they might not have that kind of leverage. So so that's why I think a sort of cooperative starting point will probably be more fruitful for smaller countries.
Right. Thank you very much, Emily and Stephanie, for your responses to the various questions. We've come to the end of this session, and I would like to thank you again, Emily, for your presentation, and Stephanie for your comments. And I would also like to thank the organizers for putting this together, and for all attendees for participating in this very interesting session. Just to say that before I go, there will be a 5-minute comfort break before the next session, and Tina will alert people when the next session will commence. Thank you all for coming, and we'll come to the end of it.
Thank you. Thank you for listening and hosting.